A wild close-up view of the eye of Hurricane Florence, the monster storm bearing down on the Carolinas, expected to be one of the strongest to slam into the East Coast in decades.
This storm is not a glancing blow. This storm is going to be a direct hit onto our coast.
There's nothing to prevent this storm from continuing to intensify.
Nearly 1.5 million people in Virginia and the Carolinas are under a mandatory evacuation. Already, South Carolina police reversing interstate traffic to make it easier for people to get out of harm's way.
All we know is it's coming. It's even stronger than Hurricane Hugo. Once it gets on the ground, the velocity will be more, but it'll be crawling across the ground, which means more and more rain.
Well, welcome back here to the National Hurricane Center. We're live here in the operations area where everybody behind me is watching a busy tropical activity all over the tropics. But, you know, Florence is something we're looking at. And going to the satellite, really we're looking at the aircraft data and looking at satellite. Without a doubt, you have a pronounced eye. But I want to focus on the expansion. We're really seeing some expansion of this storm. Very healthy storm. Look at the size overall of this hurricane. And if you draw a similar circle over land, you can see it's not just one state. It's not just one point. It's a large impact over several different areas, and that's what we're looking for. Look at the tropics. You look at the National Hurricane Center, look at all the different areas that we're really focusing on. Of course, we got Hurricane Florence. We're looking at Tropical Storm Isaac, Hurricane Helene. We've got an area of disturbed weather up here in the Atlantic, and another one. If that's not enough, there's another one here by the Yucatan, an area of disturbed weather, and that's what we're looking at moving into the Gulf, potentially impacting the Texas coast with time. So a lot going on with the tropics here. Let's start looking at some of the details. This is Tropical Storm Isaac, and the latest information that we have, still trying to move towards the west as a tropical storm, but with time there's an opportunity to become a hurricane, and that's why we have hurricane watches up for Guadeloupe, Martinique, and Dominica. These areas here could see some of those hurricane force winds with time and heavy rainfall, and then continuing off to the west with time. So that's just one of the systems we're looking at. And then we're also looking at, of course, the topic is Florence, and this is what a situation. The latest winds that we have, looking at the readings, 130 miles an hour. But as I said, we're starting to see some organization with the storm. So between the aircraft and looking at satellite, we'll have some updates coming up. But right around the center, you can see some of those hurricane force winds. But look how far you can get some of those tropical storm force winds and gales well away from the storm. We had some buoy readings 300 miles away, getting 12-foot seas. So this is really it's a large storm. That's something to remember as we're going forward. The other thing here is as we approach the coast, 8 o'clock in the morning, pretty close to the coast. Look at this though, 8 o'clock in the morning Saturday, 8 o'clock in the morning Sunday. What I'm trying to say is not a lot of movement. And over the 2-day period, we have movement from the coast to central North Carolina, which isn't very far. Inside the cone, there's also a margin of error where that center could be, but either way, no matter where we make landfall here, we're still going to have significant impacts when it comes to storm surge, when it comes to winds, when it comes to the heavy rainfall, and as a result, we have a hurricane watch and a storm surge watch for a big chunk of South Carolina along the coastline all the way to the Virginia, North Carolina border. So let's talk about some of those impacts. Really important to focus on the impacts, not necessarily the category, not necessarily focusing on small fluctuations in the wind speed. It is about the impacts, and one of them is rainfall. When you slow a system down, when you slow it down or stall it, you compound the issues associated with the rainfall. We are looking at 15 to 20 inches of rain. Some places isolated could see 30 inches of rainfall by the time it's all done. And it's not just a coastal event. You can see this large area of the high rains totals that we have on the coast of North Carolina. But look what happens. I mean, into Virginia, you can see some of those high rainfall totals. Look at Maryland, Delaware. Anywhere in here, you can see very high rainfall totals. And I'm going to make this comment. It's very important to remember that if you're sitting there watching and you're at the very edge of some of these rainfall totals, remember the uncertainty in the forecast. You know, several decades of doing this, I've seen some of these totals. You can shift left and right with time. So if you think you're out of the woods, you may or may not be. You really have to be paying attention and be ready for anything that can happen with these systems. When we move on, the other part of the danger here, of course, is the storm surge. And if you look at statistics, 50% of the fatalities in tropical systems is storm surge. So we're really watching that closely as well. We do have that storm surge watch from portions of South Carolina to the Virginia, North Carolina border. Any one of those areas, could get greater than 3 foot of storm surge, which is life-threatening. When you really look at the details and focus in, you can really see what happens. You can see it's not just the barrier islands, it's not just some of these portions along the coastline. They can definitely get some of the water, but when those are overtaken, the water just keeps going. The longer the storm sits, you can push the water in. And when you look at the Pamlico River, you look at the Neuse River, those normally flow outward. Storm surge forces the water the other way. Some of these rivers are going to flow the other way and push water up into these areas, all the tributaries, all the side rivers, but into these rivers a lot of water. And where it piles up, that's when we can see some of our maximum values with the storm surge. And this is a case looking at potentially what an inundation map would look like, highly dependent on the track. But a reasonable worst case scenario, you can see these 10 to 12 foot values in some of these inlets. So be very careful around New Bern. You start looking at coming up here towards Greenville and those areas. Really need to be careful with this storm surge. It's definitely a life-threatening situation. So there's the latest. You have the high winds, you have the saturated soil. We really got to be careful with the water. That creates 90% of fatalities occurs because of the water. And in this case, with the winds, a lot of trees down, which becomes a big time hazard as well. Got a special guest for us today. We're going to walk back to the back here, Dennis. We have Deputy Undersecretary Dr. Neil Jacobs here with us today, and we're going to talk to him. He's considered one of the world's greatest modeling experts, so we're lucky to have him in the building today. So we're going to talk to you a little bit about the modeling. And Dr. Jacobs, one question I get frequently is talking about people comparing the European model, they're comparing the GFS model, and they're sometimes making decisions based on that. I mean, what advice do you have for those people?
If you're going to be looking at models, it's important not to just look at one particular run of one particular model. So that's the beauty of having access to a lot of models. But also, these global models like the GFS and the Euro have ensembles associated with them that tell you, essentially enable you to quantify the uncertainty of each particular deterministic run. So looking at the ensembles, the deterministics, and also looking at the cycle-to-cycle trends. So if you have 2 or 3 cycles in a row that keep saying the same thing, it gives you a lot more confidence than one run with one solution, the next run says something totally different. So there's a lot of things you need to consider versus just looking at a particular output from a single run.
That's great advice. And Dr. Jacobs, I know you have family in North Carolina, and looking at the latest forecast, and if you were to make a phone call after this, what would you tell them?
Well, I've already talked to my wife and told her to go up to her parents' house in Virginia. They're not under any kind of evacuation warning where they are, but with the amount of rainfall we're expecting, it doesn't take a tremendous amount of wind to start blowing trees over. And if you don't have to be there, it's not a lot of fun to sit there with no power. So she'll be headed north, and my mom and sister live in Charleston, and they're headed over to the Panhandle of Florida.
Okay, great advice. We're so lucky to have Dr. Jacobs here, a modeling expert. He is our Deputy Undersecretary at NOAA, so thank you for being here. And we're watching going to be a dangerous situation continuing with the rainfall, the storm surge, and of course the wind and saturated soils. We're going to be watching it close right here in the operations area at the National Hurricane Center.